International Court of Justice will be hearing representations from South Africa and Israel related to the war in Gaza. South Africa put in the application with the court in December, accusing Israel of committing genocide. It's seeking an emergency suspension of the military campaign in Gaza that has so far killed more than 20,000 Palestinians. It all followed an attack by the Palestinian armed group Hamas on the 7th of October, in which more than 1,000 people were killed and over 200 were taken captive. Now, let's assess the country's prospects now with Professor Francis Boyle, who is an international human rights lawyer. A very good evening to you, Professor. I'm grateful for your time on Newzroom Africa. So you've spoken in recent days and you believe that South Africa, in fact, has a good chance of success in this matter. Let's talk about where the greatest areas of potential success for the South African matter lie.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. My best to all my friends in South Africa. I single-handedly won 2 World Court orders for the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina against Yugoslavia to cease and desist from committing all acts of genocide against the Bosnians. And based upon this experience, I have read all of the pleadings by the South African legal team, and I believe South Africa will win. And indeed, they've won already by getting hearings before the court on Thursday and Friday.
And in terms of what you've seen from the papers, I want to get your take then on the assessment by the Americans, because in a briefing just a few days ago, John Kirby basically used words such as meritless, without basis, in describing the South African government's case that is before the court. How would the Americans come to such a conclusion when people such as yourself, who've in fact argued before the same court, say there is merit to this?
Yes, the Kirby and the Biden administration have said this because they are complicit in genocide in violation of Article 3E of the Genocide Convention and the United States government's own Genocide Convention Implementation Act. So when South Africa wins the order, the complicity by the Biden administration will be undeniable.
And when you say that the United States, the Biden administration, has been complicit in genocide, that's not a small thing to say, words not to be taken lightly. What are the potential implications then for the White House, legally?
Well, let me say President Izetbegovic in Bosnia, pursuant to my advice, authorized me to sue Britain at the International Court of Justice for aiding and abetting the Yugoslav genocide against the Bosnians. So I have experience on complicity in genocide, and that's the position the Bidenites will be in when South Africa wins that order.
And I want to get then your sense of the strength of the Israeli response to what South Africa has laid out in these papers. And the South African government, of course, has, in compiling its document, its paperwork, shall we say, for the court to decide on, cited, in fact, utterances made in Israeli media, for instance, by some senior people in the Israeli government to prove the case for potential genocide committed in Gaza. How can they get around that? How can they get around a pronouncement of guilt?
They can't. I've read very carefully the what we lawyers call admissions against interest by highest level Israeli officials. They're all there in the South African documents. I did the exact same thing twice against the highest level officials in Yugoslavia, including their president, Slobodan Milosevic. I just hanged them with their own statements at the World Court. So South Africa is doing exactly what I did, and I'm sure they're going to win. You have to understand, I did all that work by myself as one lawyer single-handedly. South Africa has put together a very high-powered team of international lawyers headed by my friend, Professor John Dugard, who is one of the top international law professors in the world and had been UN Special Rapporteur for Palestine. I read all their reports. They're excellent. So he's in a perfect position to successfully and his team. Of course, I want to point out, technically, the attorney of record on the case is the South African ambassador in The Hague. Professor Dugard and the team report to him, but Dugard is lead counsel.
And I want to bring to everyone's attention remarks that were made by an Israeli government spokesperson, I think it was Mr. Levy, who suggested, in fact, that South Africa was giving political and legal cover to Hamas. They say, basically, and I'm paraphrasing, that there'd be none of the bloodshed that we're seeing now with tens of thousands of Palestinian lives lost in Gaza if Hamas, which they've designated a terrorist organization, had not attacked Israel on October 7th. How much regard would the court pay to that? Is it enough context to justify what's happened in the last 3 months?
Well, as to this charge, let me say this. I was involved in the battle against the criminal apartheid regime here of South Africa, here in the United States and all over the world. The entire world looks up to South Africa for moral leadership. That's what your President Ramaphosa has said. So this spurious allegation against South Africa, no one's, I mean, the only people who might take that seriously are the United States government that fully supported the criminal apartheid regime in South Africa. But the rest of the world doesn't take this seriously.
And I wonder if the pronouncement by the court at the end of this process will help in any way to significantly make the distinction between the Palestinians, the many hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, close to 2 million, who are stuck in Gaza under the worst conditions, even before Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, and the group itself, because while it has committed horrors, atrocities that no one has denied on October 7th, Hamas and the Palestinians aren't necessarily one and the same thing, even by legal definition, right?
That is correct. The provisional government for the state of Palestine, for which I've served as a lawyer, has no command and control over Hamas.
So going forward then, should, as you're saying, South Africa be successful at the court, what does it all mean? It is significant, but because the court's findings have an issue around enforceability, that's where the struggle has been, would it be a hollow victory for Pretoria?
Of course not. Republic of South Africa then can take their order to the Security Council for enforcement as provided for by the United Nations Charter. And if the Americans veto enforcement, as they did Nicaragua's order, then South Africa can take their order to the UN General Assembly for enforcement against Israel under the Uniting for Peace resolution. The consequences for Israel could be quite serious. The General Assembly could suspend Israel from participation in its activities, like it did to the criminal apartheid regime in South Africa, like it did to my adversary, the genocidal Yugoslavia. The General Assembly could admit Palestine as a full-fledged member state. No UN member state has ever been destroyed, and Israel and the Zionists want to destroy Palestine and the Palestinians. Third, the UN General Assembly could set up an international criminal tribunal for Israel as a subsidiary organ under Article 22. I started an initiative to that effect that was approved by Malaysia and Iran and many Arab and Muslim states in the General Assembly. It had been sabotaged by the usual suspects, but I would hope when South Africa wins its order, it would be resuscitated. And finally, the General Assembly could adopt comprehensive economic sanctions recommended to the member states. If you follow the news media right now, North Korea suffers under terrible economic sanctions. Not that I support them, but that all goes back to a UN General Assembly resolution under the Uniting for Peace resolution. So the consequences for Israel could be quite severe.
But do you think realistically that the United Nations General Assembly would go in that direction, given that some of the commentary around that possibility has already been that Israel's allies, including the United States, would likely use their influence, their relationships, financial and otherwise, with some of the other member countries, member states, to basically ensure that there is protection for Tel Aviv?
Well, all you need is a two-thirds vote, and states that don't vote don't count in the final tally. But you are correct. The United States and Israel will bribe, threaten, intimidate, and blackmail the member states, the UN General Assembly, to prevent enforcement. Yes.
And that brings up the long-standing conversation, does it not, about the role of the United Nations in what it was established to do, in part, which was to ensure global peace and security. And increasingly, it appears to be failing in that mandate precisely because it's a case of Animal Farm, where some animals are more equal than others. When you consider, for example, just what the Security Council does and how those with the veto power are able to curtail any process, and how relationships outside of the UN framework between countries can influence what ultimately happens within the plenary.
You are perfectly correct. The very future of the United Nations is at stake here. And for that reason, South Africa is fighting for all of us. It's fighting for all humanity, and it's fighting for the future of the United Nations. That's correct.
Is it an
but
essential?
I'm afraid I have to go. I have to go to another interview.
Thank you very much for your time, Professor Francis
Sure.
Boyle. Good to have your time.